Welcome back, everyone. Approaching 6:44, and we are talking about trains because it was 2 weeks ago today that Premier Daniel Smith announced plans to look into the first province-wide passenger rail system. So how realistic is this idea? Joining us this morning to talk more about it is David Cooper, the founder of Leading Mobility, which is a transportation planning firm. David, good morning. How are you?
Morning. Thanks, Vanessa, for having me.
This is a very interesting topic, so lots of questions. So the first one for me, does Alberta, specifically Edmonton, Calgary, we'll start with that corridor first, is there enough population to warrant high-speed rail between the two big cities in this province?
Well, I think we should go back in time first. There was a report done about 10 years ago that looked at the feasibility of high-speed rail, and it said about in 2014 that it wasn't feasible and there would be a capital cost of 6 to 10 billion. But I think there's a few things that have happened since. One, we have 1 million more people living in Alberta. Edmonton and Calgary continue to build out their LRT networks, and we're seeing continued growth along the Highway 2 corridor. So it's been a long conversation with Albertans about should we have a train or should we not. What's been interesting with this announcement is that at the end of the day, the province sees themselves as having a role as potentially a convener or to facilitate this conversation to maybe even help build one of these particular train systems. And it's been very interesting to see the conversation as of late on this.
Okay, so, with that though, I mean, what kind of, how much could it cost? And, we're talking about connecting Edmonton and Calgary, their airports, and then Red Deer potentially. When it comes to, those kind of connections and high-speed rail services, do we have enough connections within each particular city to make it all work, to make it feasible from kind of that perspective, from the ground up?
Well, we've never had a province-wide rail study done before, and in order to determine what we're actually building and what the scope of the project is and who's building it and when is it going to be built, you need a plan. And you can't go to your funders unless we understand the feasibility of each type of these train services we're looking at. We don't understand how they're going to be built, what's the alignment of them. So it's hard to give a full answer on that. Just to give you an example, not just from Edmonton and Calgary, we still have a lot of questions about how do we connect Edmonton International Airport to the downtown and the city plan. It's identified as a particular corridor. But it hasn't been defined what we're looking at. So I think part of the conversation is having a 15-year capital plan, understand what is in scope, how we're going to build it, and what's going to be the best approach to putting in these services is a key question. Who's going to ride it? Airport transit, number one rider for airport transit services in places like Vancouver, when I worked at the TransLink, or we look in Toronto, is actually airport workers. So how do we look at the different types of services and who's going to be on them is just as important as how we're going to build them.
I want to kind of get your perspective. I look at the situation down in California where they're trying to build high-speed rail. There's been a lot of opposition. Costs have increased exponentially. What's not to say what's happening down in California, where there is a vastly greater population, would not replicate itself here, just even between Edmonton and Calgary, when it comes to land acquisition, that kind of thing.
Well, there's a lot more constraints in California. One, California has pretty significant environmental regulations and approval processes in their planning policies. The second is we don't have a lot of right-of-way. Right now, there was a conversation in San Francisco from connecting the Cal train and the high-speed rail to the Transbay Transit Center, and it's $8 billion, but it's going through one of the most built-up parts of the United States. So we don't have maybe that complexity. There would be some complexity here in Edmonton about crossing North Saskatchewan into downtown from anything that comes from Calgary or the airport. At the end of the day, I think people will have to realize these are high value, high dollar figure capital projects, and to even get one even built, we have to understand what is the scope, what's the scale, what are we trying to build, and I think part of these questions will be answered as part of this work.
Okay, and I guess, David, just finally, what are you looking for over the next several years when it comes to kind of watching the development of this project unfold, vis-a-vis, firmer numbers on costs, right away, that kind of thing?
Maybe I'm a boring policy nerd, but I think the thing that excites me the most is actually having the province have a role in this conversation of what is public transit and what is passenger rail and what their role is in it. What we're seeing is there's conversations about how their interest and understanding could be they be a future Metrolinx or regional transportation provider, as we see in the with government of Ontario and the Greater Toronto area. Are they going to become something more like a TransLink in Metro Vancouver? So seeing what their role is in actually not just funding the big ticket capital projects, but potentially looking at being more in the operations side or with different partners as part of the mix is something that I'm quite excited to see and learn more about where this work goes on from this point.
It'll be a very interesting conversation in the years ahead. David, thank you so much for your perspective. It's greatly appreciated.
Thanks for having me, Vinesh.
And stay with us, everyone. We're back after the break.